America's founding was the greatest renaissance of freedom, opportunity, and justice in history. George Washington, the founders, and the countless men and women of previous generations have built the American experiment and left future generations with the principles to guide us into the future. In this pilot episode, we will explore the 6 principles that Washington outlined in his 1796 farewell address as we pursue a more perfect union in America for a more peaceful world. Let's get started. Patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm your host, Sherman, here with our very first episode of Friends and Fellow Citizens. As a reminder, this episode comes out every Monday at 6 a.m. Eastern Time on your favorite podcast app. Be sure to look out for future updates on when the episode is released, depending on your time zone. And I really hope that this podcast serves as an important and a tool for all of us to reflect on and think about the issues that face our country today. Today, I'd like to cover just a few of the issues and challenges we face as a country, and how America's founding can be a huge inspiration for all of us trying to make this country better than ever before. At the time of this recording, we are in the middle of a pandemic. The coronavirus pandemic has unfortunately taken countless lives. We are in the middle of an economic crisis where millions of Americans have filed for unemployment benefits. Countless people have had their internships canceled, or their new job offers revoked, have had vacation plans canceled. As a result of this pandemic, we are facing incredible challenges and uncertainties on how we can proceed to restore some kind of normality. During these times of crisis, we need leadership more than ever. Quality leadership, obviously. Right now, we look at ourselves and we think, what is going to happen in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year? Who knows? Now, I'd like to start by telling a brief story about quality leadership here. There's an author named John Maxwell. He wrote a book called The 5 Levels of Leadership, a book published in 2011. And he recounts the story about something called servant leadership. And after I tell you the story, I'll explain what that actually means. On a rainy day during the American Revolutionary War, George Washington rode up to a group of soldiers who were trying to raise this large wooded beam up high to construct some kind of a building. And then the corporal who was in charge was shouting at them, telling them that they could do it, that they could raise this very heavy, bulky wooden beam. But the soldiers who were trying to construct and raise this beam in position kept failing. They couldn't do it for some reason. Now, Washington was watching this entire time, and he approaches the corporal and he asks him why he didn't join and help. And the corporal says, well, don't you realize that I'm the corporal? And General Washington heard this and he said, I beg your pardon, Mr. Corporal, I did. So Washington gets off his horse and goes to work with the soldiers, and he gets that oak beam in position. Now, as they finished, General Washington wiped the sweat from his face, and he said, if you should need any help again, call in Washington, your commander-in-chief, and I will come. That is a perfect example of servant leadership. Now, there are a number of official definitions of servant leadership, but essentially, servant leadership is when a leader's main goal is to serve others. This is quite different from other types of leadership where it's about a particular organization or a group of followers. But for servant leaders, it's always putting others first and helping others develop certain skills and certain characteristics that enable everybody, including the leader and the follower, to progress to a higher level and to accomplish more than any single individual. Throughout this podcast, we're going to be really looking at a number of examples shown by Washington, of course, but also of other leaders who have shown this kind of servant leadership. I just think it's quite an admirable feature and something to really keep in mind as we listen to guests and stories and discussions about how leadership is making America a better place than it was before. Now, leadership is just one of the characteristics of Washington, and one of the things that I really want all of us to keep in mind is really the founding principles of not just George Washington and the founders themselves, but of America. I recently read a phenomenal book by John Avlon. He is a commentator and writer for a number of different channels and sites, and he wrote an incredible book called Washington's Farewell. Essentially, this book is talking about how Washington's farewell address is very much an underrated document. Now, I was particularly excited when I first picked up this book because I had always regarded Washington's farewell address as a very precious document that specifically outlines how the future America beyond his presidency could work to resolve numerous issues and be able to sustain itself for years to come. And then as I was reading the book, one of the things that really struck me was just how comprehensive and valuable Washington's principles are in his farewell address. An address which, by the way, he was originally going to submit to the governors at the time and the country back in 1792. Washington served 2 terms as president, but he decided that he would serve for the country for another 4 years. And it's the values and writings that he wrote down in that farewell address which really gave me a lot of inspiration to create this podcast. And just some of the things I want to highlight. And I was so fascinated by Washington's farewell address and the great commentary that I've read in Avlon's book and other sources that I actually wrote down some of the values and principles from the farewell address. Let's start with the first one, faith. Washington really believed that faith and morality must have a place in any society, and especially for America. It's just that our system of governance and society must have common moral values. One of the quotes I found in that farewell address states this, quote, "Where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice?" End quote. In other words, if we don't understand and practice our obligations to our faith and to moral values, then how can we explain just some of the ways in which we live in society? For example, why is murder illegal? I mean, that's a very silly question maybe to ask to the average person, but there has to be a source of where laws like laws against murder are coming from. Washington also talks a lot about how we need to have various different religions, of course, in America, and not for the sake of diversity, but because people will practice different religions, and it's all about how we can foster a country that can put together a plurality of different religious values and practices so that everyone can practice religion without fear of prosecution. Another principle I wrote down was independence. Now, when we say independence, I don't just mean, of course, the independence from the British because of the American Revolutionary War. Washington was talking about a different kind of independence. He was talking about how the United States should not be meddling in foreign countries' affairs, especially and perhaps notably if other foreign countries are taking advantage of us. Essentially, one of the most important things we have to keep in mind when we think about Washington's stance on independence is that the United States needs to focus on building relationships with other countries for the benefit of the American people. That is the role of the U.S. government. And I think one of the biggest lessons I got from Washington on this point in independence, and I'm sure others can relate as well, which is that states, nation states specifically, will fight for their own interests. It's just part of human nature. It's part of identity, but it's also part of governing philosophy, which is that governments will fight for the people whom they represent. Now, whether or not they do a good job of that is another thing. But in terms of the interests of different nation states, Washington understood that there are going to be significant differences in the mandates of different countries. And this is an especially important topic when we think about foreign policy, we think about trade, and we think about all the different moving components in diplomacy and military policy and whatnot. This is really something that I think is going to be an incredibly important topic as we go along in the podcast. So a third value that I wrote down is fiscal responsibility. Now, I'm sure most of us, including myself, will think of the national debt when it comes to fiscal responsibility. I think there's a number of people in this country who believe that we shouldn't be spending all this money. The national debt, as last time I checked, was about $23 trillion. That's a lot of debt, and that's a lot of expenditures. And really, it just comes down to an ability to increase revenue and decrease spending to maintain the financial situation of the country. And Washington definitely knew that this was going to be a contentious and important topic. But I think the way he outlines this problem is just so succinct and so clear that it's almost hard to imagine that we could be struggling on this particular pillar here. Here's a quote from the farewell address. It states, quote, "As a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. One method of preserving it is to use it as sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace, but remembering also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much greater disbursements to repel it. Avoiding likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertion in time of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned." Unquote. Now, this quote, I think, really encapsulates the big problem here, which is that we need to be conscious of the amount of money we're spending. In fact, of course, the U.S. government is not spending its own money. It's spending every single taxpayer's money. And there has to be some kind of a conscious decision-making process that allows people to say, well, hold on a second, let's not spend too much money on this particular area or that particular area or on this program or that program, because who is going to pay for it? Ultimately, someone is going to have to pay for what we buy. And I think Washington completely understands that there are times of crisis and times of conflict where you will have to spend more than what you can make. However, it's really that realignment process, realigning back to fiscal responsibility, that becomes a really major issue for both parties, I'd argue. Now, this next Washington quote, which proceeds right after the one I just read, I think also encapsulates this need for a better fiscal responsibility strategy nationwide. He states, quote, "Not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. The execution of these maxims belong to your representatives, but it is necessary that public opinion should cooperate," unquote. Now, this is a really interesting quote because we often spend money on things that we might get or that future generations might get. But where is the cost burden? That cost burden might not be for the future generations. We have to pay for what we get. Unfortunately, we are living in a system where a lot of those costs have been passed on to future generations. I mentioned the national debt just a little while ago. I don't think there's a single person in this country who wants to raise their hand and say, yes, I like $22, $23 trillion in debt and I'll help pay for it. It's a very difficult issue to work with because you're dealing with an astronomically high number of debt, and yet current generations are essentially saying, well, someone's going to have to pay for it and it might not be us. Washington wants us to really be careful with how we're spending. And he continues, quote, "To facilitate to them the performance of their duty, it is essential that you should practically bear in mind that towards the payment of debts, there must be revenue. That to have revenue, there must be taxes," unquote. I think this quote is so unique because Washington is not really getting to the discussion of whether or not to raise or lower taxes, which is often the debate. And of course, it should be part of the debate on fiscal responsibility. He's basically just outlining basic math here, which is that if you need to pay off debts, you need to have some kind of income. And if you need to have income, you have to have taxes. And future administrations and Congresses have to deal with that. It's not something where you take on debt and then you hope that someone will clear that debt for you. This isn't a gift from future generations. This is an obligation, a financial obligation. And we might not like it. We might not like the fact that we have to pay for certain things, but just like anything, just like going to the store. If you buy a candy bar, for example, someone had to make the chocolate. Someone had to make the package. Someone had to deliver it to the store. And as a result, someone is going to get compensated for that work and for that effort. Now, this next value, I think, is just something that's so important in our day and age, and that is civility. I don't think it's of any surprise to anyone that civility has not improved as much as we wanted to. You take a look at the partisanship that's happening in Congress, partisanship that's happening here in local communities. You have people who essentially want the same kinds of policies or the same kinds of results, but these people wanted them in different ways, and yet there is no or little attempt to facilitate real conversations about how this country can move forward and progress even with differences of opinion. There's no doubt that the founders really felt that civility is key to any strong country. And George Washington wrote about this in his address, and it was something that he felt needed to be solved during his presidency. Now let's take a look at a quote from the address. Quote, "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism," unquote. Now there's some really powerful words there by President Washington. Spirit of revenge, frightful despotism. Using these terms to describe what I think many people are truly afraid of, which is a nonstop fight between different tribes of people. And all of us certainly understand what the effects of these fights are. It's crazy. You've got people who are ostracized from their communities. You have people who potentially lose their jobs. You have people who physically fight each other out on the street or in some other arena. You have people who are just filled with anger, filled with emotion, filled with hatred towards one another. And this is incredibly devastating for our civics and for the integrity of our country. And this is something that I hope we can reflect on and keep in mind and mitigate as much as we can, because our country needs to have civil discussion and needs to have better politics. And Washington knew exactly how a dysfunctional political system completely taken over by partisanship would result in people taking advantage of the destruction that's happening and create even more tyranny, the kinds of tyranny that we fought against in the American Revolutionary War. Washington continues with this quote. It says, "But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty." I think it's such a powerful message for Washington to talk about how partisanship and lack of civility is a breeding ground for additional tyranny. It allows people to forget the governmental mandate that the U.S. government must have to protect and ensure prosperity and liberty for all the citizens. The words, the ruins of public liberty. I mean, how scary is that term? But we are living in very partisan times, and unfortunately, we need to have great leadership. And that leadership cannot exist without great followers and great people who can bring those leaders to the national stage and bring back some civility. Now, there are some leaders currently right now in D.C. who are addressing these issues, I'm sure, and people will have their own perspectives on who's doing a great job on that. However, it's only a handful. I really believe that it's only a handful, and I think people want more. They want more leadership on this particular issue so that people can voice their opinions without fear that someone who disagrees with them because they're in different parties won't go after them and threaten the civics of this country. Washington actually characterizes this partisanship as, quote, a fire not to be quenched. It demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest, instead of warming, it should consume, unquote. In other words, this is not just about putting out fires. You know, when we have an instance of partisanship, we cannot just treat it as something that we could just extinguish right at that moment and just hold the fire extinguisher out and put out any fires of partisanship or wherever we go. We need to look deeper into the institutions. We need to look deeper into the society that we have built. We need to find ways that reform and make better processes so that we don't let despotism from partisanship come about and wreak havoc on our political system. Now, on the flip side of this partisanship is another value that Washington really espouses here, and it's national unity. We need to have common ground. Even though people live in different parts of the country, people have different interests, people have different prospects and different career paths that they want to take, we need to have some kind of a system that allows citizens, by birth or choice, to thrive in America and to be able to work with others to create a better nation. Washington writes, quote, "The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes." Unquote. What's quite incredible about this quote, especially in the context of 2020, is that when Washington wrote this quote, this was the 1790s. States such as California, Montana, even Texas, you name it, so many other states had not even joined the Union at the time. And yet Washington already knew that there were already factions within the original 13 colonies and, of course, other states that eventually joined the Union. And he knew that those differences can only be greater in absolute numbers. Now, the way different parts of the country work together is something that has to be considered, and he might not have really known how a bigger country, a bigger United States of America, would reconcile with itself on particular issues. Throughout our discussions, I think we're going to be really honing in on what really unites us and how we can come together at times of success and times of crises so that we can put our heads together and be able to solve the issues that really matter. Because that's what all of us want. All of us want to come together as much as we can. No one likes divisions. No one likes it when people cannot get along. Washington says that it is your union that ought to be considered as a main prop for your liberty, and that the love of the one ought to endear to you the preservation of the other. Unquote. Essentially, Washington wants us to look at our union as a vehicle of liberty. I recently talked about how partisanship is a vehicle for tyranny, but unity, on the other hand, is a vehicle for liberty and for freedom. And only if we can preserve that freedom, preserve that union, can we have that ability to truly protect the freedoms and liberties we are given, we are granted, inherently granted. And with that unity, we need something else as well to ensure that we can constantly have those civil discussions and those democratic processes that we all cherish. And that is strong national government. That's the next virtue that I wrote down. And essentially, with a strong national government, we have to respect its authority. We have to respect its authority. We might not like government policies. We might not like the way certain decisions are upheld by the courts. We might not agree with the fact that a particular individual is holding a particular office. But it's so important that we understand that if we want to make change, we do so with civility, not with violence, not with mob rule. And I think it requires a population to really exhaust all options on the table to respect the authority in order for any kind of consideration for different means of achieving change. Washington talks about respect for its authority, of course, meaning the national government's authority, compliance with its laws, acquiescence in its measures. It is so important that America follows the Constitution and ensures that every single thing we do is constitutional. And if we want to make changes, we do so with an explicit and authentic act of the whole people. Those are George Washington's words there. Washington also states that to make change, we have to find ways that do not damage the overall integrity of the system. Because I think oftentimes we hear from individuals who want a particular outcome in government policy or in societal behaviors, but these individuals oftentimes call for the most radical methods of creating a new outcome. And we have to be really careful about that. We can't let someone break the entire system altogether just for an outcome, when in fact there are different ways of creating a better outcome without having to, of course, sacrifice the system. This particular value, of course, ties back into civility, ties back into the other values which enable us to control ourselves and to ensure that no one takes advantage of the system for their own personal gain. And that, I think, is really, really phenomenal, a really phenomenal concept to explore. And the last value I want to briefly touch upon is education. Now, Washington and the other founders truly believe that an educated population is essential to any democracy. And I think when we talk about education, I don't think we should just be talking about civics. I think civics has largely become a very technical term in terms of how people remember particular dates or particular events. I always argue that for education, we need to have not just a better way of teaching the technical aspect of civics, but we also need to teach people the narrative of civics. When I say the narrative of civics, I mean the incredible stories behind both the famous heroes that we often hear about to the unsung heroes of America. I think through those stories, people get to understand and connect a bit more to their country, and they connect more to each other. It's these stories of both successes and failures that keep us motivated, that keep us going. It keeps us vigilant of some of the problems that past generations have confronted. I really hope that education becomes a more essential part in our civic duty, not just in terms of the politics of education when it comes to funding, when it comes to public schools or private schools or charter schools, etc. It really has to deal with something much more encompassing, which is how we teach civics in America. And I really hope that this podcast is going to provide more people with knowledge and resources that can really fulfill the civics duty which we all believe in. We all believe that is essential for a healthy, rigorous democracy. And those are the principles that I wrote down: faith, independence, fiscal responsibility, civility, national unity, and education. But I decided to redo these principles and rewrite them so that it reflects more of the different levels and different aspects of our country and certain principles that I think should be highlighted as its own category. And so I've rewritten some of these principles and I've outlined them with these 6: patriotism, faith, fiscal responsibility, civility, education, and national unity. These 6 principles will be a memorial to our ancestors who fought for this country and a guiding light for all of us nowadays and in the future to bring this country forward in a positive direction that no one had ever anticipated before. Just like how our ancestors didn't know what exactly was going to happen in the future, but they knew that if they took advantage of their time and of their efforts, the future generations will reap those incredible fruits of liberty, opportunity, and justice. In subsequent episodes, I will be covering each of these principles, going deeper into those values, talking about the different aspects of those values and how we can all apply them to our everyday lives and for our civic participation. And our guest episodes will feature special guests who have worked towards public service, who have worked towards upholding these values in their lives. And I think it's going to be a great opportunity for us to hear their stories and to hear their experiences and their knowledge and expertise. And I really hope that you will enjoy them as much as I will. I'm very, very excited for this. This is a big project. This is a great moment. As difficult as times are now, this is our moment. This is our moment to shine. This is our moment to step forward as leaders, step forward as loyal American citizens or as loyal American allies, stand up against the evils that have plagued the world before and ensure that our country is in great hands and it is in a better shape than the one we were born into. I want to conclude with a story that happened not too long ago. In fact, it happened last year in 2019. At the time, I was a congressional intern for a member of Congress, and one of the duties of an intern is to give Capitol tours. And one day I was giving a tour for a mother with her son. Her son was about 6-7 years old. And as we were finishing the tour involving the crypt, which is the level below the rotunda in the U.S. Capitol, the little boy asked me somewhere along the lines of, Sherman, I want to do the Pledge of Allegiance to a great American flag. And I don't really get that kind of response or that kind of question or request from my visitors. And I told him, I said, we have a beautiful American flag that drapes on top of a stairway, the stairway that leads out to the very front of the Capitol. Let's do the Pledge of Allegiance in the Capitol Rotunda facing towards the flag. And as we walk up the stairs, he gazes at the beautiful rotunda, the beautiful dome, the beautiful paintings, and the statues that surround the center. And as the boy took in this beautiful scenery, I then pointed back towards the stairway that we had just come up with that American flag hanging over it. And I told him, I said, let's do the Pledge of Allegiance together. And so here I was with my hand over my heart, his hand over his heart, his mother filming him with her phone. He led the Pledge of Allegiance right in the Capitol Rotunda amidst all the other visitors and staffers walking by. Just a beautiful moment. And when I think about that story, I think about the fact that he and I and many others are the next generation. He has pledged allegiance to his country. And it was a beautiful moment that I would never forget. It's that American spirit within this little boy that I was amazed about. It's because of people like him that motivate me to go into public service, that motivate me to do this podcast, that motivate me to pursue a career of living for others and not just living for oneself. That, I think, is so powerful. And I hope that you will join me in this great journey of ours to make this country greater than it has ever been before and to restore those valuable principles, those 6 principles I outlined for you, so that we can come together as one people and as one nation for one United States of America. And on that note, thank you so much for listening and for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. I can't wait to release more episodes as time goes along. Remember, every week, Mondays at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, make sure you subscribe and share this podcast with your friends and family. I look forward to seeing you soon, talking with you soon, and have a great rest of your week. So long.